want to go quick so we can have more time for the general conversation. I thank Christy, first of all, who I have the closest relationship to in terms of the Latino stuff. I think that very closely ingrained local study of Iowa reminds us that most of what the Catholic Church done is not lobbying. My very final point actually was what your whole paper was about, but it's what individuals are doing on local levels that collectively have an impact across the entire country. And that's something to always keep in mind. It's not just lobbying of bishops or major players and so on. My question, I guess, if I would ask one question, might be to both of the other panelists, what is the relative weight of Catholicism versus the rise of white Catholics to the middle class that's been most influential on some of the shifts that all of us have talked about, but especially you two, in one way or the other? I don't want to take time to answer that now, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think there's just the difference in the emphasis. You gave class and that I gave abortion. I think there's probably a disagreement between us, but it's also, I think, still an open question. Oh.
Let me be evasive and say, let me give some thought to that for the next few minutes, because I don't know if there is a disagreement. It's more, I think, a question of, well, yeah, your question is about relative weight, right? So I guess what you're seeing here is the relative weight that we're giving. I mean, certainly I wouldn't say that abortion has absolutely nothing to do with this. Oh, I'm sorry. I certainly wouldn't say that abortion has nothing to do with this. So I think what you're seeing here is simply two dimensions of a problem. Yeah, I have a feeling also, I mean, just to pick up on Leslie's very last comment about feeling like you're in a political orphanage. I think that's what a lot of us feel. I really do. At sea, adrift. Yeah. I mean, what did Peter Steinfeld call that book of his, A People Adrift? I think that's a perfect way to describe American Catholics right now. Yes.
Yeah, I think abortion functions in a funny way more symbolically than actually. As I say, if you look at polls, most Catholics don't want to reverse Roe v. Wade. Personally, I think it would be the best thing that could happen to American politics, because then you'd have to hammer out abortion laws state by state, and people would have to be honest about what works and what doesn't. Roe v. Wade just allowed us to suddenly become evasive and not really talk about concrete details of reform.
I want to maybe take that in a different direction, because I think, just to add on to one of your comments earlier about the imbroglio over the Obamacare, I think that a lot of the Catholic discussion about contraception there was, I think that a lot of talk about religious freedom is a proxy for Catholic argument about contraception. I mean, I think it's because we don't want to be honest about what we think about contraception, and we don't want to have that argument. We have to have that argument. We have to have that discussion. And just, talking about this in terms of religious liberty, like I said, I think it's just it's a smokescreen. It's a proxy. We don't really want to talk about this, but we have to.
But just to follow up on the symbolism thing, I think what happens as the Democratic Party over the course of the 1970s, it doesn't happen overnight. There's still a lot of, sort of Democrats, liberal Democrats, who are very uneasy about abortion publicly in the 70s. And then by 1980, the split is open, it's real, and in effect what the Democrats say to their longtime Catholic constituency, we really think that this woman's vote, the young people, they're more important than you are. We don't really care. And if there's an issue that you cannot disagree with in the Democratic Party today, it's abortion. You have got to take the party line. And there was a period in the mid-'80s when we were discussing an anti-missile defense system, and Democrats kind of said, well, we can disagree about this among ourselves. Really? But not about abortion? I mean, come on. And it was a way, if you say symbolically to a group, as the Republicans may discover, we don't want you, we don't respect you. Your concerns are not our concerns. Yeah, you will break ties of loyalty that may go back for generations. I think we should open it up to the...
Yeah.
Let's open it up, and there are mics on either side. Raise your hand if you want to speak, and someone will come and give you the mic. We have a lot of people here who are going to want to speak, so if you ask one question at a time, and then if we have time later to come back, we will. So.
I was wondering, Professor Eugene, I can't see the last name.
Oh, McCarraher.
McCarrick. You ended by saying that there's no hope for Catholic theology and cultural resources except through a kind of a reevaluation of liberation theology. So what would that look like? Because it's clear that the Catholic Church is sort of wavering between being a cult on the one hand, where it's you've got to have all the dogma, and fitting in with society and working. So what would be the outlines of a liberation theology return for the Catholic Church?
Well, remember my answer was that we need to have a conversation about this. I mean, I don't have like a 10-point agenda, you know, or some kind of a platform that I'm going to unveil today, right, and run for president on. I think there are two things. One is that I think that Pope Francis has indicated, it seems to me, a certain openness toward reopening this question and reopening this issue about liberation theology. He's made all kinds of friendly gestures, even toward Gustavo Gutierrez, who was pretty much demonized during the previous two papacies. So I see this as a, you know, as what they say, what do they call it, a window of opportunity. I also think that, and I didn't mention this in my remarks, probably because it's been said so often, but sometimes the obvious needs to be resaid, which is that many young people are very interested in Sanders and in socialism. I see it, at least, among my own students. And Villanova is, you know, often called Vanilla Nova, you know, for a reason, because it's a lot of white upper middle class students. And when you see white upper middle class students wearing Sanders buttons in numbers that I would never have predicted, even 5 years ago, I would think that that's a tremendous opening for revisiting a lot of these ideas. Obviously, you know, liberation theology would have to be somehow reconstructed for the conditions of the 21st century, of a new kind of capitalism, you know, a world in which ecological pressures are going to be growing. But I'm actually quite hopeful, which is not quite the same thing as being optimistic. But I think it's always good to be hopeful, because you never can tell.
Can I jump in there and say something as well about the liberation theology? This is what I find so exciting, what I would call grassroots Catholicism. I was just at a forum in University of Arizona in Tucson, and there were you know, young adults who were living in intentional Franciscan communities, Catholic worker farmers, Latino, Black, and white, who were really using liberation theology kind of language. And so throughout the Midwest, you see a rise in Catholic worker farms right now, too. There's 3 in Iowa alone. So I think it's really starting to erupt new forms of liberation theology, and you find that care for the land, creation care, and stewardship, that is one discourse and praxis that's really aligning Catholics and Protestants where they're coming together. Most Catholic worker farms, the majority of those who live there are actually not Catholic. They want to live in the spirit of Pierre Morin and Dorothy Day, but I think for me at least, Catholic worker farms are indicative of this a new kind of liberation theology. And also the priests that I've been working with, I mean, they really want to see, you know, immigrants in particular, you know, being given care. So there's a lot of language of care, whether it's creation care or care for immigrants, you know.
Hi, I guess this is a combination of liberation theology with historical context that I would like some clarification after many years. Going to a Catholic liberal arts college in the late 60s, my very first theology course was with a priest who had been very active in liberation theology, taught that very much as an introductory course with a lot of elements. And from a personal standpoint, I thought, I can really get behind this. Within a semester or two, he was asked to leave the university. All of a sudden, what I had understood liberation theology was no longer, at least at this Midwestern school, something that was being espoused. In fact, it kind of had gone the other way. Does that resonate with any kind of context at all, that those of you who study it?
What's the time frame again?
Late 60s?
I mean, when you think of the liberation theology from Latin America, the first major book is actually 1971, A Theology of Liberation, Medellin. So I don't know exactly what that priest would have been teaching you. It might have been coming out of the civil rights movement. I want to add a little comment. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on this, but there's actually a lot of conversation in theology now, that's my area, about the theology of course, Pope Francis, which is known as Teología del Pueblo, the theology of the people. And it's a little known kind of branch of liberation theology, because we should say liberation theologies. There's not just one. There's lots of ways where people have tried to engage the gospel in ways that are, liberating and for change and so on. Pope Francis's version, which has been rising in Argentina for a long time, is just not that well known. Gustavo Gutierrez, my colleague at Notre Dame, his is the most famous and the most influential and well known. But it's much more focused on the changing of structures and social analysis in light of the gospel, whereas, and this is a very broad generalization, of course, so I'm not going to do it justice, whereas Teología del Pueblo has been much more focused on helping those who are disenfranchised, poor people themselves, for example, to become agents of their own evangelization and of their own lives in kind of productive ways that might lead to change, but it has to start with them. And that's always Pope Francis, it's always been his big point. It's got to start with the people. It's got to start with the people. Some have accused this as being too tinged with Peronism. Vita Perón's husband, who was so influential in his native Argentina, and that's where some of the debates go. But there have been, since the 70s, since you were there, it depends on where you go, to which Catholic school, lots of versions of liberationist kinds of theologies. They're not all the same, but they're all rooted in the gospel ought to do something in public life. It ought to change the world around us, not just our individual souls. And I don't know why it happened at your school, but that's not fallen out of favor everywhere. It's very favored in many places. Does that help? I don't know if that gives you a scenario to locate your experience.
Yes, this is very informative for sure. Tim, you talked about the voting numbers and patterns, okay? And then Eugene kind of got into the discussion of ideologies. And then we heard a little bit more localized in Iowa and Latino issues on the job issues. And then we heard about the makeup of Catholic religion affiliations in politics. So I have a question, and look for your comments about this. What do you think you'd be saying today if we, years ago, and I'm referring to myself as a Catholic, been in the seminary, and I always heard when I sat in the pews, when I was encouraged to live my life as Christ wants us to, okay? I never heard that live it that way until it hurts. I heard just the opposite. Sometimes it will hurt. So I ask you, along the lines of what Pope Francis has said, that unfettered free market capitalism, and that's a key word, unfettered. Unfettered free market capitalism is truly a tyranny on the marginalized, and with that he was lashed upon by all other thinking people. What if today the pulpits were used with the power that they have, with all of the people that are involved with all the different scopes that you spoke from, and use the power of the pulpit to not just address how you help people after they've fallen through the cracks, but how do we address the institutionalized and systemic cracks through which so many fall? So I'd love to hear your comment on your view of what would the world look like, or your view of the world, given that change. Thank you.
Well, let me start. As a former Detroiter, and given the way I was raised, my first instinct would be to say it's time for the Catholic Church to once again be a really energetic proponent of the right to unionize, because that's one thing that can narrow the gap between the haves and those who are not so well off. I'm afraid, though, I have to tell you that my particular parish is located right behind the Supreme Court, and we sometimes get some rather fancy people in line for communion. And my pastor, whose commitment to Christian charity, I don't doubt, is so careful to be nonpartisan in everything that he says that it's almost painful. He almost has to eschew the gospel sometimes because it's so disturbing.
I mean, ditto, about the right to unionize. Yeah, because I think the revival of the labor movement is absolutely key. Not simply, I think, in the sense of, raising wages, pushing for better working conditions, subsidized health care and whatnot, but also because of this, this technology question that I raised. I cannot emphasize this enough. The new kinds of automated production technologies are going to wipe out entire classes of employment. I think this is one of the biggest issues that we never talk about. Because many of us, I think, if I would add to the right to unionize and actually taking part in the labor movement, it is an assault on the technophilia that I think Catholics share with other Americans. This fetish of technological innovation is one of the most insidious things that I think we have in our culture. It's literally going to end up putting us out of jobs. So it isn't simply you see people walking down the street and they almost bump into you because their heads are too embedded in their eye crap. This is part of a larger thing. This is part of a larger technological apparatus. And I really wish Catholic social thinkers would address this with the kind of ingenuity and the kind of historical context that a lot of other people have.
Yeah, I think the big thing, immigration reform and unionization, most, if not all, there might be one that's unionized. Plants, meatpacking and slaughterhouses plants in Iowa are non-unionized. And again, I mean, all the workers are being pit, the Mayan workers are being pit against the long-term Latinos, against the Burmese, the Sudanese, the Congolese. So all these recent migrant and refugee groups are constantly being pitted, and they're even though they don't like the working conditions, if they don't want the job, somebody else is in line. So I think the unionization, I absolutely agree with Leslie. I think immigration reform, I'd like to see more priests openly embrace it, but there's a fear, among some of them. And I really like your point about the fetishization of technology.
That's a great question, so I'll answer too. Echoing what others have said, how does the church help build the mediating institutions on which democracy is built? I think Pope Francis has got this right. It's not just about getting people out to vote, it's what you do after you vote. It's how people participate at the local level. I didn't say this much, that's the part I skipped in my talk, but the faith-based community organizations that I talked about, the largest religious funder of those for the last 40 years have been the U.S. Catholic bishops through the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. They've put a lot of energy into that. Some of that falters a bit now. But as Pope Francis himself did when he was in Buenos Aires, how do you get people who normally don't participate because they're so marginalized to find that they have a stake in their community, that they got a voice, that they can do something, and enable them to do for themselves. So it's not always the national issues, the ones that we're deciding now in presidential election, but how at the very local levels the church can enable people and walk with people in a nonpartisan way to get involved in the kind of local decisions that make their lives matter for their families. There's where the church can have its greatest impact. I think that's where Francis has kind of taken us. That's what his message is. You got to get people engaged at the local level. That's what he himself has done. I think that's the best the church can do. And I like the thing, the difference between hope and optimism. Are we ever going to fix the whole thing? No, you can't ever fix the whole thing. But can you be on the right side of making the world better and giving people a sense of a common project that leads to hope, that faith can make a difference, that they're taking a stake in their own lives? That's where the church can have its ongoing and greatest impact.
I managed to get a microphone, so I'm going to use it. First, let me just say this is a terrific panel, really unusually good. I think I'm very grateful. Thank you all. I take the point that there isn't a Catholic vote in the sense that there is no Catholic bloc vote. Catholics don't all vote alike. But I guess I'm wondering at a sort of deeper level, for which segment of the American voting population, if any, is Catholicism determinative or sort of decisive of voting behavior? So from a social scientific point of view, when does it make a difference to know that the people in question are Catholics, right? So class is a very strong driver of voting behavior, and race is a very strong driver, and whether that's sort of emerging kind of nativism or immigrant status or whatever it might be, ethnicity. So I guess I'm wondering, crudely speaking, what explanatory or predictive power does knowing that someone or some group of people are Catholics actually have? For whom does it have any explanatory power in terms of voting behavior? Which people can we say vote differently on account of their being Catholics and having distinctively Catholic beliefs than they would do if they had all the same other demographic markers but were not Catholics? Or is Catholicism actually just not doing any explanatory or predictive work in terms of people's political affiliations or voting behavior?
Well, I mean, historically in this country, and I believe it was true in Great Britain as well, if you knew someone's religion, you could probably guess with 90% accuracy how that person would vote. It was true for much of the 19th century and a good portion of the 20th. Obviously, people no longer have those same intense political loyalties. Many fewer Americans today identify themselves as members of political parties than used to be the case. Americans are also less likely to identify themselves as members of a church. They switch denominations a lot more often, so it's part of a general, I guess you could call it individualization of society, a less and less likelihood to want yourself defined by institutions or traditions. In terms of the Catholic vote today, the one group where you might say religion's really making a difference would be Catholics who attend Mass weekly or oftener, and they are a very heavily Republican group. On the other hand, they're also older and I think somewhat more affluent than the national average, so those factors may be at play as well. But I don't think we should underplay religion here, and I think for groups like that, abortion is important. To what extent, again, they want to reverse Roe v. Wade, to what extent is it a kind of symbolism for concern for Catholic values, or a kind of general sense that if you'll kill babies, you'll do almost anything? I can't say, but it's a flashpoint issue for them, I think.
I'm going to go back to that's similar to the question I actually asked Leslie to start with, and I don't want to be read, and I don't think anybody is, but religion does matter. How much does it matter? Maybe Leslie and I are going to come to, is it 40%, 60% class and these other factors, but I think religion matters to many Catholic voters. It's not the only factor. Other factors weigh in. I think there's a scenario where for some people, they are voting more what their neighbors are doing now if they've kind of reached a certain class, and they can use the teaching of bishops to kind of justify on moral grounds and kind of say, I've taken the higher moral ground here, and sort of ignore maybe other motives that might be there consciously or not. But that is not to say, as Leslie said, and I would agree with her on this, it does matter. That's one of the considerations that people bring into mind. Certainly for Latino Catholics, I would add that to the group of Mass attending white Catholics. I mean, there's still a preponderance for the Democratic Party because of perception of economic issues that represent their, and because of their perceived position on immigration, which they would take as a moral issue as well. So it's a factor among various factors. I think someone who's studying this, and I'm not a political scientist, but someone who's studying, has to try to weigh out relative weight and not simply label something a class vote or a Catholic vote or an ethnic vote or a regional vote, but see how with individual constituencies all of these factors come together, religion, Catholicism in this case, of course, being one, but not the only one.
Yeah, the question is whether, are Catholics like Jews? That's the one group where you can sort of see, despite tremendous social mobility, a continued commitment to liberalism. I was remembering, as you asked the question, a scene from the mid-'60s. I'm community organizing in Chicago, right? ironically. I mean, it's not that I don't take the automation threat seriously, I do, but this community organizing project in 1965 was premised on the assumption that unemployment was about to go through the roof because of automation. Well, it took longer maybe than we expected. But there was some old rummy who used to hang around the office, and he came in one day drunk and was spewing all sorts of really ugly racist stuff. And one of my colleagues, Tony Helstein, whose father was actually the president of the then flourishing United Packing House Workers Union, looked up at him, and how she intuited this, I don't know, because you don't run into a lot of Jewish alcoholics, but she said to him, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" And he, in his haze, he said, "Well, yeah." And then she said, "You have no right to talk that way then." And I don't know if Catholics talk like that anymore, or if they ever did. But there was some sense that religious identity and a certain kind of political ideology were so closely intertwined that you had no right to talk that way if you were Jewish. And, you know, I used to hope that Catholics might be like that too, but maybe our experiences are too diverse and we're less tight a community, I don't know. Would Jews talk that way today? I'm less sure.
I would like to, last week I went over to SIUE to, Bernie Sanders was in town. I just wanted to experience the energy of young people. There were 10,000 students. We got over there at 8:30. We had to walk a mile to get to the end of the line, then walk another mile to get into the... But the point is that the energy of the young people, and what you were saying about the young people that don't know, what are we doing to help these young people who are looking for hope? They're looking for jobs. They're looking for substance in their life. And whatever safe place is there than our universities and our colleges to guide these young people around the social, what do you say, the gospel of wealth. Let's move on. Francis is saying, abortion and countries that know certain important things, but that's not the issue. The issue has got to be social justice. How do we... Bernie brought up a wonderful thought about climate change. He's just now beginning to talk about climate change. And if anybody's ever read Laudato Si, that Francis saying, that is the most comprehensive approach to life and relationship and nature and God that, and our brothers and sisters that there is. And so what are we doing to help channel this energy of hope that the young people are saying? And it was an incredible experience. And I would just hope that all of us sometime, what's his name? Trump is going to be in town next week in St. Louis. And it would be interesting to go listen to that hate environment to a hope environment that at least Bernie is trying to help bring about in our society. I don't know what my question was, but I just...
No, preach it, brother. Preach it, brother.
I don't know this, and I don't know what my answer is either. So maybe we're getting along really well.
Keep talking.
I have my youngest is a senior in high school, and he's talking about, of course, making a choice for college and thinking about, Dad, how am I going to do this in such a way? He says, I want to study something important, but I want to get a job afterwards, and give me some advice on how to do this. And I look at him and I think this is the first generation in American history, at least for Catholics, who went from immigrant to child of immigrant to grandchild. Everyone's done better than, in my family, it's a straight line on both sides, Croatian and Irish. Everyone's done better than their predecessor, right down the line. And we're about to hit a point where maybe the next generation, that's not going to be what's going to happen. I look at my brothers and their children, and it's already not. Some of my brothers have children older than me. Then I look at the young Hispanics I work with in my work, who are much, much less privileged than my son. He's had a good Catholic education. He's had, good friends and good opportunities. And they don't have a lot of opportunities. But as immigrants and the children of immigrants, God, are they hungry? They know they're going to do better than their parents. Of course, they haven't got as far to go. But they are hungry. They're very hopeful about America. They think America's great. My son's not anti-American, but he's wondering, how am I going to do this? How am I going to make it work? And I don't know if that's what young people are getting excited about with Bernie Sanders, is saying, your parents did great things, your grandparents did, you can too. You know, there's a way that you can also achieve the kind of greatness financially and otherwise that your previous generations have. And maybe that's, at least that I see from Anglo kids who are resonating with that message, and Hispanic kids who kind of already have that sense that we're here, we got to do something big on behalf of our parents who have sacrificed for us.
Yeah, I'm part of a lot of conversations at Iowa. I'm co-chairing this Humanities Advisory Board, and one of the conversations we have is how to make the humanities relevant today. And I think the humanities, students take our classes, right? They love them, but they feel like, and it gives them hope. They talk about these big ideas. Then they feel like, well, they're not going to get a job, right, if they major in religious studies or all these things, right? And so I think one of the things that I try to emphasize to my own children, they're, almost 13, almost 10, and almost 7, is do what you love and love what you do. That whole language of vocation, right? I'm from a Lutheran background, and so vocation is a big thing among Lutherans. You hear vocation. I think if we, those of us who are in the humanities and the related social sciences, we just encourage young adults to just do what they love. Don't worry, if you really like STEM, do STEM, but if you're not very good at it, major in art, major in something you love, and you will thrive. And I think we're starting to see a movement towards that now, but the humanities, I think part of this lack of hope among a lot of young people is that they haven't felt like they could really find a true vocation, that they have to be forced into certain jobs or things. So I'm hopeful for them.
I guess what I'd add to that is it's often said, I mean, I want to connect this, what's said about the Sanders campaign, to what's sometimes said about Christianity in general, which is that it's not realistic, right? It's not practical. My argument would be, this is not utopia. Okay? All of this can be done. Right? Everything I think that Sanders is asking for, I'll just do a pitch here, it can be done. It is simply a question, in many ways, of having the political will to do it. I think this is also applicable to what I think often needs to be said about Christianity, which is that it is a form of realism, right? It is not idealistic, right? The justice and charity are part of the architecture of the universe, and therefore, when you act generously, when you act justly, when you act charitably, you are being realistic. You are not being idealistic. Yeah, it will hurt. It will hurt. But, I mean, I love that phrase from King that, the arc of the universe is long, but it tends toward justice. Well, it does. That's not just the statement of an idealist. It seems to me that that's a statement of Christian ontology. It's built into the very world that's created. So I don't want to hear this talk that it's unrealistic or that it's not practical. That's just a way of saying that you don't want to do it.
One last question.
Yes, I'd like to address my question to you, Leslie. I suspect that you and I belong to the same church, despite the fact that I'm an atheist Jew. That's a different branch of the religion. But my question to you, and perhaps to the rest of the panel, is to what extent is the issue of contraception, abortion, gender a wedge issue amongst Catholics, in your opinion, that would cause them to vote basically Republican?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that contraception is an issue for Catholics. And frankly, it wasn't really an issue for the bishops either until gay marriage surfaced as a likely thing about, something about to happen. We went for decades after Humani Vitae in 1968 with the bishops just not talking about it. Well, if it's a mortal sin, you ought to be preaching it, right? They don't. Until gay marriage, it was useful because if all sexual contact has a procreative purpose with which you may never interfere, then gay sex is by definition immoral, and there's no discrimination about it. It just contradicts the purpose of sex as God gave it to us. And then it intersected with this business around healthcare. The bishop's peculiar animosity toward Obama does puzzle me. I don't know where it comes from. I won't reduce it to racism. I don't think that's at issue. I suspect that for them, he represents the kind of technocratic success of a certain kind of liberalism and a certain generation, and they feel just kind of a gut hostility to him. But abortion, I think, is a wedge issue for some Catholics, but probably a minority among them, except insofar as it kind of resonates symbolically. It says that the Democrats are no longer a natural party for Catholics. There are a lot of Catholic Democrats who just hold their nose and avert their eyes from the issue, or they engage in other kinds of civil disobedience, like the letter I write to my bishop every time the annual collection comes up to fund the bishop's appeal, that as long as he's got money to fight health care. And I remember being taken to rallies for something that preceded Medicare when I was a kid. Now I'm collecting it. I mean, it's really great. See, it shows you a little bit that America can work. That I've been waiting for this for my whole life. And if you guys want to use my money to try to undermine it, well, you're welcome to it. I'm going to send my check directly to Catholic Charities, and you find money from somebody else. And actually, when they called me one year about this, well, why didn't you contribute this year? I gave that little spiel to the kid on the other end, who must have been about 14. He was so young. And there was a pause. And he said, we hear that from a lot of people. And, my heart leapt up. We're out there. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we belong to the same church, in other words. Even though I won't see you at Mass on Sunday.
Well, please join us for a reception, and please join me in thanking our panelists. This was a great event.